Welcome to one of the most unsettling disappearances ever whispered about in the forgotten corners of Louisiana's past. Before we go any deeper, take a breath and remember this moment, because what you're about to hear will not leave you easily. The year was 1847, and along the banks of the Mississippi River, where the cypress trees bowed like silent witnesses, a notice appeared in a local paper. Just a few lines of ink, easy to miss, printed between ads for cotton gins and patent tonics. Missing, Mrs. Evelyn Duval, last seen on the night of April 10th. That was all the world was officially told. No hysteria, no scandal, just a quiet erasure. But history, like the river, has a way of revealing what people try to bury. They called her the vanished bride, a plantation wife who simply stepped out of recorded existence. Some said she was taken. Others swore she ran. The truth, however, does not lie in official records or polite Southern retellings. It lingers in burned journals, torn ledger pages, and the kind of whispers shared only when lanterns are low and doors are bolted. What happened that night was never meant to be spoken of again. Yet here you are listening, which means the story has found you, just as it has found others before, always at night, always when the air feels heavier than it should. Before we continue, if stories carved from silence and shadow speak to you, then step closer. Subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching. Let's see how far this forgotten tale reaches and who dares to follow it into the dark. The notice was printed without fanfare. No bold lettering, no desperate plea from a grieving husband. Just a narrow column, pressed tightly between advertisements for horse liniment and plantation tools. It read, "Missing, Mrs. Evelyn Duval, wife of Mr. Gerard Duval of St. James Parish. Last seen at approximately 8 o'clock on the evening of April 10th. A reward is offered for her safe return." That was all. No description of what she wore. No mention of witnesses. No emotional appeal. Just a transaction, as if a misplaced item had been noted in a ledger. To anyone outside the parish, it was forgettable. One woman gone in a place where people vanished all the time. Runaway laborers, lost river workers, nameless faces swallowed by the swamps. But locals who read that line felt something different. They knew the Duval estate. They knew the weight that plantation families carried, along with the secrets they buried. And they knew that a white woman of standing did not simply disappear without noise. Yet the paper stayed quiet. No follow-up report. No escalation. It was as if the notice itself served a different purpose. Not to find Evelyn Duval, but to document, officially and publicly, that she had been declared missing, so that whatever came after could be folded neatly into silence. Those who handled the paperwork likely never wondered what became of her. Ink was applied. A record was made, and with that, the world was expected to move on. But stories like this don't end where official ink dries. They begin there, along the curve of the Mississippi River, where the water moves with a slow, knowing rhythm. The Duval plantation rose like a monument to pride. 12 white columns stood across its front, tall and severe, casting long shadows across the veranda at dusk. The locals said the house never looked welcoming. Not even at celebrations. It watched more than it lived. Built high on raised foundations to avoid the river's seasonal floods, it seemed less like a home and more like a sentinel, one that had seen too much and spoken of nothing. The air around it was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to skin like a warning. Cypress trees loomed at the property's edge, their roots twisting into the earth like gripping fingers. Even in daylight, mist hung low over the fields, giving the rows of sugarcane an otherworldly shimmer. Workers moved silently through that haze, their figures ghost-like, their presence acknowledged only in ledgers and labor counts. The sound of the mill machinery grinding cane into profit echoed day and night, a constant reminder that everything here existed to serve one man's ledger book. Evenings were worse. As the sun sank and the sky bled into shades of rust and violet, the mansion seemed to exhale, as if something restless stirred within its walls. Lanterns would flicker to life on the balconies, a soft glow against the pale columns, but the light never made the house feel warm. It only accentuated the distance between those who lived inside and those who toiled below. Visitors described an atmosphere they could never quite name, a heaviness, a quiet tension beneath the courtesies and polished floors. Some called it the weight of Southern dignity. Others, more honest, called it what it was, the presence of unspoken things held in place by fear, by reputation, and by the unrelenting river that carried away every secret except the ones rooted too deep to drown. Evelyn arrived not as a wife seeking a home, but as a transaction sealed in ink and expectation. She came from Charleston, escorted by reputation and family arrangements rather than affection. The newspapers of New Orleans described her as a graceful addition to Louisiana society, a phrase that sounded more like furniture delivery than celebration. Her marriage to Gerard Duval had been announced with formal elegance, highlighting business ties and family alliances. Love was never mentioned. It wasn't required. Inside the mansion, her presence registered more as ornament than person. Portraits were commissioned, gowns were fitted, and her place at the dining table was fixed like part of the decor. Servants addressed her as Mistress Evelyn, but in her letters, those few recovered years later, she never once referred to the estate as home. Instead, she wrote, "This place feels like a gallery of roles, and I am expected to perform one without ever stepping beyond its frame." Those who saw her at parish gatherings recalled her as poised but distant, always composed, yet never entirely present. She moved through rooms like someone memorizing steps to a dance she never chose to learn. Around her, the wealthy planters' wives observed with polite interest, measuring her every gesture for compliance with unspoken rules. And Gerard, ever conscious of scrutiny, ensured that she smiled exactly when she should and remained silent when she must. Behind closed doors, however, the house told a different story. Servants reported that she spent long hours in the library, a place rarely entered by plantation wives. She requested books not of fashion or etiquette, but of philosophy and banned authors. At night, faint candlelight could be seen flickering beneath the library door, long after the rest of the mansion had gone still. It was in that quiet rebellion between ink, paper, and thought that something unrecorded began to stir. Henry Carter's name did not enter the Duval estate as a person, but as an entry in an inventory log. Male 26, literate, skilled in carpentry, sound of body. No mention of where he learned to read. No note of the hands that once held tools by choice rather than command. Purchased in New Orleans in January of 1846, he arrived like every other name in the ledger, evaluated, assigned, owned. The plantation records marked him as H.C., a pair of initials repeated across work schedules and supply tallies, always paired with a value, never with a voice. Yet even in those cold records, small anomalies hinted at something beyond routine servitude. His first assignment was not to the fields, but to the interior of the mansion, a rarity for a newly acquired laborer. The notation read, "To manage books and catalog library." An unusual directive in a place where books served more as symbols of refinement than objects to be handled. Rumors surfaced quietly among the household staff. Some said the new man moved through the library with a familiarity that unsettled Gerard, touching the spines of volumes with reverence instead of ruin. Others recalled that Evelyn, for the first time since her arrival, lingered there too, not to supervise, but to watch, to listen, to speak in the soft tone one uses not with servants, but with equals. Those who observed closely noticed that when Henry handled a chair, a shelf, or a piece of molding, he did more than repair. He restored, as if he believed that even structures built on pain could be made to stand with dignity. It was a quiet defiance, subtle, almost invisible. But in a house where every movement was measured, subtlety was enough to be dangerous. In that library of polished wood and hushed discontent, two lives entered the same room, one recorded as mistress, the other as property. But history has always underestimated what can ignite in silence. The library had always been a room of performance, a place where Gerard displayed leather-bound volumes more for reputation than for reading. Yet once Henry was assigned to its upkeep, Something shifted beneath the polished veneer. Servants who passed by spoke of low conversations between him and Evelyn, never loud enough to catch words, only the cadence of thought shared between two people who were not supposed to speak as anything but mistress and servant. It began with books. Titles removed from shelves not for decoration, but for meaning. Rousseau, Voltaire, the banned philosophers of revolution and liberty, authors whose names were rarely spoken aloud in households built on obedience. Evelyn would ask for a volume, not directly, but by lingering near its shelf until Henry placed it gently on the desk without a word. He understood before she asked. That understanding became its own vocabulary. Legend notes grew strange. One entry noted Henry's temporary reassignment to field labor, punishment apparently, for being found in the library after hours. But just days later, another entry returned him to his original post, annotated simply, at mistress's request. No overseer questioned it aloud, but whispers traveled quickly. Something invisible had begun to form between them. Not yet a scandal, but enough to shift the air. In the evenings, when the rest of the house retired, a single light would flicker behind the library's shuttered windows. Evelyn, seated at the long oak desk, would trace passages with her fingertip. Henry, standing beside a shelf, would pause in his work only when she did. They rarely faced each other fully. They didn't have to. Their rebellion lived not in declarations, but in glances held 1 second longer than permitted, in words left deliberately unspoken. In a place where reading was considered dangerous, they had found something far more incendiary. They had found recognition. In plantations like Duval's, silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Yet silence has a rhythm, and when that rhythm changes, even the most controlling eyes begin to notice. Gerard Duval, a man who believed ownership extended from land to name to breath itself, began to sense something had shifted inside his house. Not in shouts or scandal, but in pauses. He first noticed it at dinner. Evelyn, usually quiet but mechanically present, had begun to drift. Her gaze no longer lingered on the superficial conversations of visiting families. Instead, it fixed somewhere beyond the room, as if listening to a voice that wasn't there. When Gerard spoke to her, she answered correctly, but with the slight delay of a mind pulled from somewhere else. Then there was Henry. Once invisible in his labor, he now moved through the house with a stillness that caught attention. He did not shrink under Gerard's presence as others did. He neither challenged nor appeased. He simply existed with an internal calm that felt, in its own way, like defiance. Gerard began rearranging assignments. Henry was sent to field work. Evelyn was restricted from the library except during daylight hours. The door was locked at night. Yet every attempt to reassert control only deepened the unease. Evelyn did not protest openly, but something in her posture sharpened, like glass beneath silk. Servants reported low arguments behind closed doors. Furniture moved at odd hours. The master's footsteps echoed more sharply down the halls, paced with suspicion. At times, he would stand at the threshold of the library, key in hand, listening. But listening for what? For scandal? For betrayal? Or for the moment power slips, not with a scream, but with a single decision made in quiet rebellion? By the time Gerard truly understood what was happening, the river had already begun to rise, and the house, for the first time, had something to hide. Spring rain began just after sunset on April 10th, 1847. It came not in a storm, but in a steady, deliberate fall, the kind that soaks through the earth slowly, as if giving everything time to prepare. By 8 o'clock, the Duval mansion was shuttered against the weather, and the halls echoed with the muted sounds of routine, dinner trays being cleared, lanterns trimmed, doors locked one by one. At 7:46 p.m., a servant brought tea to the library. Evelyn was there, seated near the window, watching the rain trace lines across the glass. She gave thanks politely, but did not speak further. The servant remembered her expression not as sad, but calm, almost expectant. At 8:03 p.m., she was last seen moving down the corridor, a shawl around her shoulders, her steps measured and silent against the polished floor. No alarm was raised. Why would there be? Wives walked halls. Servants passed unseen. The house breathed in its usual order. Yet something subtle had changed in the air. 8:19 p.m. A stable boy reported seeing a lantern moving near the back path that led toward the river, where boats sometimes moored without record. He assumed it was an overseer. No one followed. 9:02 p.m. Rain intensified. The library window, later examined, showed signs of being unlatched from the inside. No screams were heard. No doors forced open. No signs of struggle. Just a sequence of quiet moments that, in isolation, meant nothing, but together formed the outline of an exit no record would acknowledge. By dawn, two things were gone from the Duval estate: a woman and a name written only as H.C. The river carried on, unhurried, indifferent, its surface holding no memory of footsteps. By the morning of April 11th, the plantation woke to absence. Not panic, just a hollow space where routine expected faces. Evelyn's room was found undisturbed, the bed neatly made, as if she had never intended to return. Henry's quarters, inspected shortly after, showed no signs of haste. His tools were still in place. His ledger entry for the next day's assigned labor waited in ink, unaware it would never be completed. Gerard issued orders quickly, but not the kind one gives when searching for a missing wife. There were no public appeals for her safety, no pleas to neighboring estates for assistance. Instead, riders were sent with a different command: locate the runaway slave, bring him back, or ensure he cannot return. Evelyn's name was mentioned only as a casualty of a supposed abduction, a detail added to lend outrage to a hunt that had already begun. That was the official story, printed, circulated, believed by those who preferred their world unshaken. But beyond the columns and courthouses, another version moved in whispers. Servants spoke of belongings packed days in advance, a small valise hidden beneath floorboards, pages missing from Evelyn's journal, a comb left behind, not forgotten, but placed deliberately on her dresser as if to say, "I am leaving this life, not losing it." They spoke too of Henry, calm in the days before the disappearance, his eyes steady, not desperate, as if a path had already been chosen, and all that remained was the moment they would step onto it. Two people vanished. One story was written down, repeated, protected. The other lived only in the spaces between words, carried mouth to ear in low tones, when fires burned low and masters slept. One story served order, the other truth. The search parties rode out at first light, dogs straining against their leashes, overseers shouting orders as they fanned across the swamplands. But those who watched closely noticed a pattern. The men were not searching for her. They were hunting him. Every question asked at river docks, every coin slipped to informants, every printed notice pinned to a post centered on one objective: the capture of Henry Carter, dead or alive. Evelyn's name became an accessory to the pursuit, useful only as justification. Her portrait was not circulated. No detailed description was ever issued. The reward posters mentioned her only briefly, as if she were a mislaid possession rather than the missing person. In courthouse records, the case was classified under property disturbance, Negro escape, not missing persons. Even the language of law erased her from her own disappearance. As days passed, Gerard began methodically scrubbing the estate. Her letters were collected, her belongings inventoried, journal pages removed. Servants who knew too much were sold off to distant parishes. Those who remained learned to speak carefully, shaping their words to fit the narrative their master demanded. One misstep in tone or phrasing could decide a fate. In less than a week, the official story solidified. A trusted house slave had fallen into delusion, kidnapped the lady of the house, and fled into the wilderness. Newspapers repeated it without question. Neighbors nodded grimly, relieved the scandal had a shape they could understand. History was not rewritten later. It was rewritten as it happened. Each signature, each ledger update, each newspaper line, not to reveal truth, but to bury it beneath ink. And once the ink dried, the world was expected to move on, never knowing that somewhere beneath those neat columns of print, a very different story kept breathing. Years blurred into decades, and the Duval plantation passed into ruin. The great columns collapsed. The fields returned to swamp. Nature reclaimed what history tried to sanitize. But even as the house rotted into the earth, the story of that night did not vanish. It lingered, unearthed not in archives, but in whispers. Locals claimed the land changed after Evelyn and Henry disappeared. Animals balked near the old foundation. Tools left overnight would be found moved by morning, damp with river mist though no rain had fallen. Hunters spoke of hearing footsteps that did not belong to any creature, pacing just beyond the tree line. One man, passing near the ruins at dusk, swore he saw two figures walking side by side, one pale like moonlight, the other shadowed but steady, both turning their heads as if aware of being watched. They never spoke. They never pleaded. They simply walked, not as ghosts begging to be remembered, but as people who chose a path, and were never allowed to finish it. In time, historians arrived with equipment, theories, and confidence in official reports. They left with none of those things. Journals turned up in unlikely places, with pages missing. Tools with initials carved into the handles were found buried beneath blackened soil. A pearl comb, half-burned, surfaced in a church attic 100 miles away, wrapped in cloth like a relic too important to discard, too dangerous to display. The Duval case appears in formal records only as an unresolved incident. No bodies confirmed, no grave marked, no resolution filed. But in the catalog of whispered history, the history carried in quiet tones and glances, in the unrecorded heat of human choice, the story has never ended. The river still runs, the ground still breathes, and some say, on April nights when the air grows heavy, they still walk. There's a place along the river where the trees grow close enough to block the sun, and the air hangs thick with the scent of wet earth and forgotten things. Locals do not mark it on any map. They do not point to it in conversation. They only say one thing when asked where the Duval plantation once stood. Walk far enough, and something will walk with you. They say if you stand there at the hour when daylight and darkness trade places, just as the first drop of spring rain touches the ground, the silence changes. It stops being empty. The wind, which should only carry the sounds of water and leaves, begins to echo with two distinct rhythms, one soft, measured, careful, the other firm, steady, unbroken. Not footsteps of people running, not footsteps of people fleeing, but of two souls walking side by side, neither captive, nor owned, nor missing, just walking, unhurried, unbound. And if you listen too long, if you let the sound draw you forward, the world behind you may begin to fade. For stories like theirs do not end where ledgers close, or where paper turns brittle, or where historians lose interest. They end where someone chooses to believe them. So if you find yourself there, by the river's edge, on an April night washed in rain, do not call out. Do not ask their names. Just stand in the quiet and listen, because what you are hearing is not tragedy. It is defiance, still moving through the dark.